American military power.
Joining us here on set, NBC News correspondent Mike Memoli, and with us from Washington, political reporter for The Hill, Julia Manchester. Good to have you on set, Mike. Good to see you in the flesh.
This is I was going to say, your first look debut. We
it takes possible war for you to show up in New York. Let's talk about the former vice president's response last night. As you were watching Twitter and you saw everything developing yesterday, you saw from the vice president that he was very cautious about what he wanted to say. He said, I'm going to wait and see what happens before I actually make a public statement on this. And then we heard from the vice president last night. Take us through exactly what was in his address.
What was interesting is that this speech actually came a couple hours before we saw the strikes, the retaliatory strikes on the U.S. presence in Iraq. And what the vice president was trying to convey here, though, what's interesting, he gave a foreign policy speech in New York last July. He said then that the president was dangerously incompetent and incapable of moral leadership. That speech went nowhere, though, because foreign policy was not front and center in the campaign. And so this was an opportunity for him yesterday, and he actually began his speech this way, saying, I said this 6 months ago, and the actions of the last few days have only proven that. The other thing is, I covered the White House. The event yesterday there was no crowd, there was no audience. This was exactly the kind of statement that you see presidents give in front of a blue curtain, in front of American flags. And Biden explicitly said this. He said, the president is not showing presidential leadership. I'm here. I'm going to have the conversation with the American people that the president should be having.
Julia, foreign policy and national security, not always game changers in any election cycle, but we are now on the, or maybe as of last night, we're on the edge of war with Iran. How has the crisis with Iran changed the political landscape for the 2020 field of Democrats?
It's changed it in a huge way, Eamon. I think you're seeing candidates like Joe Biden very much trying to bolster their experience in foreign policy, and as well as Pete Buttigieg really citing his experience in terms of serving in the military. However, Joe Biden in particular has really been honing in, like you saw in that speech yesterday, on his years serving on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as his 8 years in the Obama administration, really trying to bolster that foreign policy Rolodex that he has, having so many global relations and having experience dealing with Iran during the Obama administration and during that nuclear deal, and him making the case that the Trump administration should not have pulled out of that deal. However, you have Senator Bernie Sanders, who doesn't have that same experience. However, he has been very consistent for years on this anti-interventionalist stance, and he has hammered Joe Biden, and he hammered Hillary Clinton on this too in 2016 on their votes in favor of the Iraq War in 2003. So it's a question as to whether these Iraq War votes will really play a role in this primary. It played a role in 2008, obviously, with Barack Obama, then Senator, very much trying to corner Hillary Clinton on that. And then again in 2016 with Sanders and Clinton. The Iraq War is obviously, and that vote is a bit of a distant memory now. However, it remains yet to be seen whether this conflict with Iran and the involvement of Iraq will bring that memory back, and Sanders will really potentially bring it back to the forefront.
Hey, Mike, I feel like the former vice president is between a rock and a hard place right now, considering the fact that he was part of the molding of the JCPOA. He was part of the Obama administration. Iran has said they're not going to negotiate. That is off the table. That's beyond them right now. How does the vice president make an appeal to the American public to put him in a position of power, considering the fact that we are where we are with Iran right now?
Well, he said this both in his speech but also in an interview with Lester Holt, which is to defend the Iran deal, to say that sure, it didn't necessarily deal with all the issues that we have with Iran. He said, I have no illusions about the difficulties that we face still today with Iran. But he said, tearing up the nuclear deal and especially severing our relationships in some ways with our allies. We've weakened our position internationally by breaking with our allies in this, not giving them any sort of notification. He said it's made it harder for diplomacy going forward. And what's interesting, you talk about 2008 versus 2004. That's the year that the Biden campaign hopes we remember in terms of what the Iraq War vote or what foreign policy as a front and center discussion could have. John Kerry was actually in Iowa yesterday campaigning for Joe Biden. John Kerry, Howard Dean actually surged in the polls and was a frontrunner at one point in the 2004 Democratic nomination process, in part because of opposition to the Iraq War at that point. But it was John Kerry that won the Iowa caucus and won the nomination on the argument that I'm the best Democrat to face a wartime president. That's what...
Is he confident, though? Is the vice president confident he can go back to diplomacy after all that has taken place?
That's what he says. I mean, this is what his argument is that we need a new president who could step in on day one and have the relationships with foreign leaders to be able to pick up the pieces here. And he's saying no one else basically on this candidate stage can do that.
Julia, if history repeats itself like it did with the Iraq War, how might these growing tensions, you think, with Iran potentially threaten to split up the Democratic Party just in general? Because there is some kind of posturing and positioning among the Democrats between the more liberal progressives who don't want to appear like they're criticizing America at a time of war or a time of conflict, but at the same time, really trying to undermine the president in being incapable or incompetent of leading this country at a time of war.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could potentially split the Democratic Party when it comes to those more hawkish Democrats or more centrist Democrats like Biden and Buttigieg, and then the more dovish or more anti-interventionalist Democrats like Warren and Senator Sanders. We've seen that Elizabeth Warren in particular has kind of gone, in her messaging on the killing of Soleimani, she's gone kind of back and forth on how she's phrased it. She got a lot of backlash from some on the left last week when she called it a murder. That Soleimani was murdered. To some on the left, that was seen as overly hawkish, and she kind of backtracked that and tried to seem more anti-interventionalist, more dovish on the issue. However, I would say that for Sanders, if there were to be a split, that would benefit him the most because he's been so consistent on this.
All right, Mike Memoli, Julia Manchester, thank you to you both.
Thanks, guys. Still ahead, stock futures down as investors fear Iran's retaliation could lead to a bigger conflict. We're going to have the very latest on the financial front next.